Hello, thanks for tuning in. It's March 11th, 2025. Joe Zimhart here again. Today, I'm going to take a brief look at how to test someone that claims to be channeling an ascended master or a spirit or something they claim has agency outside of themselves in some way, whether it's a group being like Lazarus, Jack Purcell used to do, or some individual entity like Jay-Z Knight and Ramtha, for instance. So back in the early and mid 80s, I had a habit, it was kind of a compulsion to go and visit people at their group meetings where they were channeling spirits. And these were open invitations that you could go to. Sometimes you had to pay. I've had to pay as much as $75 once. And I picked people that claim to channel a spirit. For instance, one gentleman channeled a spirit called Zush because it was only a sound that he heard, like the sound of the universe, Om or whatever. And I spent a couple of hours with him. And then in another case of many, I went down to the University of New Mexico from Santa Fe because I saw this ad by this gentleman. Here, his name is Lyle Koehler. He was a professor at the University of Cincinnati. And this article came out in a Cincinnati paper, The Inquirer, in 1981, February 16th. Title is Criminals Fascinate Scholar, as well as Women. He was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Weaker Sex in 17th Century New England, which he did quite a bit of research for. And he's was a legitimate historian and a professor at this, and he was teaching women's studies at the University of Cincinnati when I met him. He later moved and did other things. He lived from 1944 until 2015, so he's been gone for 10 years. If you look on the internet, you will find nothing about what I'm talking about, which is a very important part of his life. And I have a personal reason why that's the case. So what I did was look at this ad where Professor Koehler was channeling a being called Heltha, an ascended lady master from Sweden who had somehow died in the 19th century and ascended. So I went to hear him, and there were about 30, 40 people in the audience. We each paid about $11, I think, to see him. And he appeared, without the beard. He was clean shaven and quite affable, told the audience about himself and was quite honest, of his accomplishments as a professor. And then he told this story he began experimenting sometime around the early 80s, I think, with automatic writing. And if you know what that is, it goes way back into a couple of centuries ago or more. But I had a professor, by the way, that did this, a metaphysics professor in the University of Dayton, and he showed us how to do this. He was from England. He was a little quirky, but anyway. So you take a pencil or a pen and a piece of paper, and you go into trance. You can do it in many different ways, but auto-suggestion is very easy for some people to go into this altered state of consciousness, and you do stream of conscious writing and see what comes out. And at first, sometimes it's just scribbling, and then after a while, like on a Ouija board when you're entranced with it, words start being spelled, and then the words form even more interesting combinations of things, and you end up with this narrative coming from some source. It could be God, Jesus, Buddha, some ascended master, or whatever that identifies itself over time. For instance, Helen Schuckman with A Course in Miracles didn't know what this voice was that kept nagging her, and finally she decided to write down what it was saying, and it was like stream of conscious. There were no commas, no periods. Wrote for 7 years, and it turned into A Course in Miracles. And only later, in the midst of this, that the voice identified itself as Jesus. So Koehler tells us in the audience that he began this process, and suddenly this being, feminine being named Heltha, Heltha, appeared and began to write through him all these messages, which had a lot to do with his readings, which he had done before, of the theosophical tradition, Madame Blavatsky and some of the occultists before her and after her. And I'm sure he had heard of Ramtha by then, because Ramtha was very popular in the West Coast. So Ramtha, Heltha, I don't know if there was a connection directly, but similar. And after some time, he began to see that Heltha took over his body, his voice, and he would begin to speak to people as Heltha. And as Heltha, at least in the audience where I was, Lyle, the person, the man, was very kind of measured, like a professor, and calm and endearing. Heltha, on the other hand, was very animated. Arms would fling around and her eyes would be wide open, and she would speak in a Swedish accent and you know, kind of a pseudo-Swedish accent. And she went on for about 20 minutes talking about the history of communication with human beings from ascended masters, going back to the Hermetic tradition, the Rosicrucians, and all of this. You know, so as a history professor, he was well read in the occult tradition, obviously. And then he allowed the audience to ask questions. So I waited, because I was used to this, and 4 or 5 people asked some questions, and then I put my hand up and stood up, and I began to ask him if Heltha was an ascended master and was beyond space and time in this altered state of ascension, and Heltha agreed. So I asked a number of questions that I knew about the ascended master tradition that you had to answer yes to, because that's what the tradition says about itself. And he said yes, yes, yes. You know, that actually ascended masters could bilocate, and they could appear in their physical, tangible bodies and then disappear at will. They could levitate, you know, so all these answers. So I said, are you in touch with the Great White Brotherhood of Masters and can talk to them at their meetings? Yes, yes, said Heltha. So here we go. So I said, there's a woman I know in Phoenix, and I questioned this woman, who channels the ascended master Djwhal Khul, the Tibetan that was introduced by Blavatsky and then later Alice A. Bailey. And this Janet McClure, who was channeling this being, the Tibetan. So I said, I know this woman. Her name is Janet. So I gave up some information, and I said, she channels an ascended master. Could you, because there's no time and space, talk to ascended master Djwhal Khul and ask him to describe Janet to you and tell us what she looks like? And Heltha went for it, you know, tallish, like 5'9", long dark hair, around 30 years old, with bright blue eyes, and, you know, went on with a rather vivid description. I said, thank you. And then I asked a couple more questions. And the audience was getting very upset with me, because they could tell I was skeptical, and started telling me to sit down. I'm taking up too much time. And I only was talking for about 3 minutes. So I said, okay, I'll sit down. And I let the show go on. And then I let Heltha know, by the way, you were very wrong about the description. You were wrong about this and wrong about that. And so the show was over, and Lyle came back to himself and talked to the audience. And apparently he was co-conscious while he channeled. Now, some channelers aren't. They claim they go into an altered state, their soul goes somewhere else, and their body is animated by this spirit or an ET or ascended being or whatever. And when they come back in the body, they don't remember anything the person said. Like Jay-Z Knight claims to have not known what Ramtha used to channel through her in the old days, but I don't know if she still holds to that. In any case, I don't believe she didn't. But Heltha was co-conscious with Lyle. So after the meeting, we went out in the lobby, and everybody was kind of talking, and most people were ignoring me. And he came up to me, and he was a tallish kind of a guy, a little taller than me. And he said, "Who are you?" And I told him, I gave him my card, and I said, "I've been examining and exploring this stuff." And he said, I had never been grilled like that before. Now, he had done about a dozen performances of Heltha across the country at venues like at the University of New Mexico in this auditorium. And we talked a bit, and he says, "Well, what do you think's happening to me?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting question. So I told him what I thought, that he had gone into an altered state, and that altered state convinced him that there was agency in the being that he was writing or that was writing through him and that was talking through him, and that I couldn't see any evidence that there was any difference between him being a kind of a semi-conscious actor of this being and the being itself. So I said, for my questions, the being you channel has no agency outside of you. And he's kind of looked, well, that's interesting. We were friendly. This wasn't an antagonistic talk. And so I shook hands goodbye and I left, and I never heard from him again. I also never heard from Heltha again. You can't find anything about this ascended being Heltha that he had invested about a year into, apparently believing in it. So I don't know. My interaction with him may have opened up some awareness in him of what was really going on here, and he decided to quit the occult world. But not so with so many other people. For instance, I came across this character, Jon Saint Germain, who's very well known in Tennessee as a psychic, and his name Saint Germain, the Ascended Master, can key you into why he took that name. And he has a priest collar on here. He's not a priest of any order, as far as I know, other than the occult. But he has gone completely down the rabbit hole. He used to be kind of a mechanical engineer, I think, when he was younger. He claims to have been the palm reader at President Obama's inauguration, and it's in the papers, so apparently he was there as one. But he has all this stuff that he sells and hawks on his website, including, $125 a minute readings that he can do for you over the phone, spiritual readings, candle settings, baths and washes, which are occult things, mojo bags he sells, jack balls, another occult thing, mirror box spells, spell jars, doll babies. They're kind of like voodoo dolls without eyes, and they're sewn specially for you. Scrying mirrors, kind of like the scrying stones that Joseph Smith did when he channeled the Book of Mormon. Hoodoo and spell learning videos, hypnosis CDs, my books, the Crystal Silence League radio hour, church schedule. So he operates some kind of a group or church. Special altar works. Now, when occultist says works, they mean they're doing spells or incantations or something where they can move the universe and the energies into your favor or whatever, or maybe the disfavor of somebody else. In other words, block some enemy's energy. So he went completely down what I call the rabbit hole, whereas Professor Koehler, to his credit, responded to what we call reasonable way of examining what's happening and decided, well, maybe this isn't so real, and went on with his life. He wrote other books. He lived, quite a few years. He apparently had a partner he lived with, a lady. I don't want to get into all of that. So I'm kind of praising him. He's one of these people that explored this, which is his right, got quite a bit out of it, and so did other people, but then turned the corner and let it drop. In any case, there's really no evidence from a science point of view, from research like Professor Diana Fleishman, a PhD in evolutionary psychology, which is a newer version of sociobiology. In all her research and looking at the human mind and its evolution, there is no evidence of ESP in the human mind. This guy here, and I'll finish here in a minute, Jon Saint Germain claims there is, because he sells a lot of products that claim there is. His argument against the science guys, the skeptics, like, for instance, Professor Diana Fleishman and me, would be that we are meat puppets, meaning that we only believe in the flesh body, the physiological body, and its limited influence in our relationship with the cosmos or whatever, and our connection with it. There is no, So he uses this dismissive, thought-terminating cliche of meat puppets in order to dismiss a whole class of people like myself, or the professor I mentioned, as being unworthy of this grand knowledge and ignorant, much like the ancient Gnostics used to call people like me Hylics. We were just mud people is what Hylic means, that have no clue about the occult worlds and never will, that we will die as like clay, dust going back to dust. We'll never have that awareness of the Gnostic with their grokking ability of the divine to go to a heavenly state. So anyway, that's the world that you enter when you do something like automatic writing and think that there's agency in the source of that writing, and then you can go into the rabbit hole that this guy Jon Saint Germain went down. So that's it. I just wanted to leave some information about a gentleman you won't hear about, and I admire him. And I enjoyed him. He was a civil, intelligent person, which a lot of people that are into the occult are, but they may have different beliefs and a different way of examining these beliefs. So anyway, I hope that helps you to understand maybe how to test the channel if they allow it. And most of them will not allow this kind of testing that I propose. Thank you for listening.